America was never the same after that February of 1964. In one of the most iconic events in music history, the Beatles made their first live appearance in the United States on the Ed Sullivan Show. I Want to Hold Your Hand topped the charts and Beatlemania conquered the United States. Celebrating 60 years of those historic events, today we will talk about 15 facts about the Beatles' first visit to the US. Before arriving in the United States, the Beatles had a series of performances in Paris in January 1964, and it was there that the Beatles received the news of their number one in America. But it was also during this period that Paul McCartney composed Yesterday. Early one morning, sitting at the hotel piano, Paul McCartney composed a melody he had dreamed of, which he tentatively named Scrambled Eggs. Paul showed it to several people because he doubted it belonged to him as a composer. It couldn't be that easy, Paul said. Paul played it to Dick James, who didn't pay much attention to it. He just said something like, "Why don't you write another one that has yeah, yeah, yeah in the style of She Loves You?" Paul kept the song for almost a year and a half until it became Yesterday. The first formal appearance of the Beatles on American television was in December 1963, when NBC's Jack Paar show broadcast some images of the Beatles in concert. This generated some articles about this phenomenon that was happening in the UK. Full of curiosity, a fan named Marcia Albert, who lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, wrote to a local radio station to ask for Beatles music. Intrigued, they imported a copy of I Want to Hold Your Hand from England for broadcast. Other stations did the same, which caused Capitol to move up the release of the single in the United States, which was originally to be released in January of 1964. Urban legend tells the story that Ed Sullivan first heard about the Beatles when he and his wife were at London Airport returning to New York and witnessed 1,500 screaming fans welcoming the Beatles back to England after a successful tour in Sweden. But Ed knew about the Beatles months before that. Jack Babb, who was the talent broker for the show, spent summers in Europe scouting acts for the upcoming season. Babb worked with Peter Pritchard, a London-based agent who was a friend of Beatles manager Brian Epstein, and more than once brought the Beatles to both Babb's and Ed's attention. During the nervous conversation between the band on board the plane carrying them to New York, McCartney had asked himself, "They have their own bands. What are we going to give them that they don't have?" A certain conservative side of the USA through the press tried to ridicule and minimize the Beatles during their mythical press conference on February 7th.
Why does it excite them so much?
We don't know, really.
Okay, now we form another group and be managers.
Many were asking aggressive questions, thinking that the Beatles were a bubble that would burst at some point. But the Beatles' particular sense of humor and experience with the media in Europe helped them not to fall into that game. And with their answers, the Beatles bent the press.
It's not true, it's not true.
One of Brian Epstein's conditions to Capitol for the Beatles to come to the US was that they spend $70,000 on advertising. 2 partnerships were made with radio stations that provided coverage of all Beatles activities, offered posters, stickers, and other memorabilia for fans who came to the airport, and distributed stickers all over New York that read, "The Beatles are coming," creating even greater expectation for the band's arrival. On February 8th, one day before the iconic performance, George Harrison fell ill and was replaced by Neil Aspinall in the rehearsals prior to the show. For this same reason, George does not appear in the Beatles' photo sessions in Central Park. On February 9th, 2 performances of the Beatles were recorded for the Ed Sullivan Show. In the afternoon, the show that would appear 2 weeks later on February 23rd would be recorded, and in the evening, that mythical show where the Beatles conquered America would be recorded live. CBS saw huge anticipation for the Beatles' first appearance, with 50,000 ticket requests for the 728-seat Studio 50, now known as the Ed Sullivan Theater, where the band was to perform, far surpassing the 7,000 requested for Elvis Presley's 1957 debut. Just before appearing to sing All My Loving and being the Beatles' first live performance to the United States, the camera director asked Paul McCartney, "Are you nervous?" McCartney said no, to which the cameraman replied, "You should be. You're going to sing in front of millions of people." This small conversation made Paul feel a bit nervous.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
John Lennon was not very happy that night of February of 1964, because according to him, he had not projected his leadership to the audience. Of the 5 songs they performed that night, 3 were in lead vocals by Paul, and the remaining 2 were shared in chorus between Paul and John. So Lennon did not have the lead vocals in any of the songs. Second, the audio on McCartney's microphone was much louder than John's. So Lennon didn't like that. If you notice the songs where they sing together, like She Loves You or I Want to Hold Your Hand, you'll notice that Paul's voice stands out more. John Lennon got upset, saying that the Americans would think that Paul McCartney was the leader of the group, which Lennon didn't like at all. The appearance on February 9th is considered a milestone in American pop culture, and furthermore, the beginning of the British invasion in music. The broadcast drew more than 73 million viewers, a record for US television at the time, broken 3 years later by the series finale of The Fugitive. The broadcast was Sullivan's first time in 7 years that he topped the nightly ratings. A typical Sullivan broadcast at the time drew about 21 million viewers.
There's no cable joining them. Oh, they're in perfect synchronization. Are they? Yeah, because they've got little...
They're all good friends.
Albert and David Maysles document the Beatles' US trip as they travel to New York City, Washington, D.C., and Miami Beach. Most of the non-musical footage is of the Beatles in hotel rooms, often acting irreverently in front of the camera. The original film premiered on 13th of November 1964 as a special episode of the CBS variety series The Entertainers, and a documentary called The Beatles, The First US Visit, officially came out in 1991 and on DVD in 2004. In 2011, the documentary called The Love We Make came out, in which Albert Maysles followed Paul McCartney around New York while he organized his benefit concert for him in 2001. On February 18th, 1964, the Beatles met the most iconic boxer of all time, Muhammad Ali. The Beatles had only been in the US for 11 days when their tour managers marshaled them into Miami Beach's 5th Street gym for a photo opportunity with 22-year-old boxer Cassius Clay, later known as Muhammad Ali, following his conversion to Islam. At the time, Clay had been busy preparing for his big upcoming fight with the heavyweight champion Sonny Liston. The Beatles, meanwhile, had turned up in Florida to film their second performance for the Ed Sullivan Show. The Uline Arena, known years later as Washington Coliseum, was the place chosen for the mythical concert that took place on February 11th. At that time, the stadium was also used as a boxing center, so the ring became the stage for the Liverpool Four. The stage was in the center, so the 8,000 people who attended that night surrounded the band. At times, they stopped playing for a few minutes to change their equipment and face the audience in all directions. Even before starting the concert, they had to turn the drums, which were on a circular platform, because they were facing away from their fellow musicians. Nowadays, there are rotating stages, but back then, it was all done by hand. Yes, the Beatles were also pioneers in this. The Beatles returned to London Airport on February 22nd, 1964 at 8:10 a.m. to be greeted by a crowd of 10,000 screaming fans. They had flown from Miami to New York, and from there back to London Airport. Their flight arrived half an hour later than scheduled. Pathé News filmed the Beatles' return and created a special report called Beatles Welcome Home, which was narrated by Bob Danvers Walker and later shown in cinemas. So far, we've finished this little video with some facts about the historic visit of the Beatles. Comment here below. Were you there? What memories do you have? And what are your impressions? Subscribe to our channel and like the video. Thanks for your time. This is Music Box.
February 1964.
We came here at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 to see them, and all they do is push you farther and farther away.